Mira Okafor had learned to read platforms the way other people read faces. 6 years as a sign language interpreter for the Transit Authority had taught her that a station has moods, the hurried shuffle of Monday mornings, the loose, forgiving pace of Fridays. Tonight, the platform at Faircross Central felt wrong in a way she couldn't yet name. Too quiet for rush hour, too many people checking their phones instead of each other. She stood near the yellow line with her interpreter's badge clipped to her coat, waiting for the 7:42 to Redbrook, half watching a boy who couldn't have been older than 9. He sat alone on the bench across from her, knees pulled up, a battered green backpack hugged to his chest, like it might float away if he let go. His hands moved constantly, not the anxious fidget of a bored child, but the fluid, deliberate shapes of someone signing to himself. Mira recognized fragments. Home. Wait. Okay. He was comforting himself in a language most of the platform couldn't hear. She didn't approach. Some kindnesses are better offered from a distance, in case the closeness itself becomes a burden. Across the platform, half shielded by a support pillar, a man in a gray coat stood with his back too straight. He wasn't checking a phone. He wasn't reading a departure board. He was watching the exits, one after another, in a slow, mechanical rotation, the way Mira had once seen a hawk track a field from a fence post. She filed the thought away, probably nothing, and returned her attention to the boy. That was when he looked up, past her, past the pillar, directly at a man stepping off the escalator. An ordinary man, wire-rimmed glasses, a canvas satchel, the kind of tired, decent face you'd forget within the hour. The boy smiled. It wasn't a small smile. It was the whole face kind, the kind that made strangers on platforms remember, years later, that once a child had looked at them like they were the best part of the day. He raised one hand and signed something quick, unmistakable even to those who didn't know the language, because his whole body said it before his hands did. You came back. The man in wire-rimmed glasses froze, and 3 seconds later, the man in the gray coat moved. Mira would replay the next 11 seconds for months afterward, trying to separate what she saw from what she only understood later. The man in gray didn't run. That was what disturbed her most, retelling it. He walked, fast but composed, cutting a diagonal line through the crowd toward the man with the satchel, one hand already reaching into his coat. Mira didn't think. She'd spent 6 years training her body to move on behalf of people who couldn't hear a shout of warning, and that instinct outran her fear. She stepped directly into Greycoat's path and signed, loud and huge, the universal flat-palmed stop, not because she expected him to understand the language, but because her body language screamed it in every direction at once, and screaming works in every dialect. He didn't stop. He shoved her shoulder hard enough that she stumbled into a woman with a stroller, and in that half-second of chaos, something in the station's rhythm cracked open. A transit officer near the ticket gates turned at the commotion, saw the reaching hand, shouted a word that, in a station full of people wearing headphones, staring at phones, standing 4 feet from speakers that would broadcast nothing but silence to at least a dozen of them, traveled only as far as sound could carry, which, in a cavernous station at 7:42 on a Thursday, was not far enough. But the boy heard nothing of it, because the boy heard nothing at all, ever, and so the boy did the only thing left to him. He ran directly at the man with wire-rimmed glasses, the man he'd smiled at, and threw both arms around his waist. Later, 3 witnesses would give 3 different accounts of what happened next, because trauma edits memory into strange shapes. What the security footage would eventually confirm was this: the boy's small body colliding with the man's legs threw his balance sideways by exactly enough, 11 centimeters, an investigator would later measure, standing in the empty station at midnight, that the man in gray's outstretched hand, and whatever it held, passed through empty air where a torso had been a half-second earlier. The transit officer's shout finally landed. Two more officers converged. The scuffle lasted 4 seconds and ended with the man in the gray coat face down on brushed concrete, and a station of 200 strangers finally, collectively, understanding that something had almost happened to them. And that was when the sound stopped. Not literally, the train still rumbled somewhere below, the departure board still clicked its cards over with a sound like shuffled decks, but conversation died in overlapping waves, radiating outward from the center like a struck bell going still. People who'd been laughing on phones lowered their voices mid-sentence without knowing why. A busker 2 platforms over let his last chord ring out and did not start another. In that hush, the only person who seemed unbothered was the boy, still wrapped around the stranger's legs, patting his side gently, the way you'd reassure someone who looked more frightened than you were. The man in wire-rimmed glasses knelt down slowly, both hands trembling, and signed with clumsy, careful hands he'd clearly not used in a long time. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head and signed back, easy as breathing. "I told you I'd wait for you." His name was Daniel Osei, 41 years old, a structural engineer who inspected bridges for a living, and had, until 4 minutes ago, believed his Thursday would end with groceries and a documentary about Roman aqueducts. He did not know the boy's name. That detail, once it surfaced in the chaos of statements and officers and someone's radio crackling for an ambulance that wasn't needed, changed the shape of everything. A woman filming on her phone lowered it slowly, her expression shifting from relief to confusion. A man near the pillar who'd seen the boy's smile and assumed reunion now looked at Daniel like he might be something else entirely. "You don't know him?" the lead officer asked, notepad already out, voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has learned not to react to anything until the facts arrive. "No," Daniel said. His hands were still shaking. He looked down at the boy, who had let go of his legs but not moved more than a foot away, watching Daniel's mouth the way deaf children learn to, when they can't yet trust unfamiliar signers to keep talking with their hands. "I've never seen him before in my life. He smiled at you like he knew you." "I know." Daniel crouched again, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, and signed slowly, checking each shape before committing to it. "My name is Daniel. What's your name?" The boy's hands moved fast, the fluent, unself-conscious speed of someone raised in the language, rather than one who'd learned it as an afterthought. Mira, still catching her breath from being shoved, stepped closer without being asked, because interpreting wasn't a job to her in moments like this. It was closer to breathing. "He says his name is Tobias," Mira translated, watching the boy's hands as closely as his face, because the two never lied about the same things at once. "He says," she paused, frowning slightly, then continued, "he says you have his father's face." The station, already quiet, seemed to lean in. Daniel's mouth opened, and nothing came out for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had the careful, hollowed-out sound of a man walking backward through a memory he hadn't opened in years. "What's his father's name?" he asked. "Ask him what his father's name is." Mira signed the question. Tobias's face changed, not fear, but a kind of practiced sadness, the sort a child learns to wear when a question has been asked of him too many times by too many adults who didn't understand the answer. His hands moved. "I don't know his real name. Mama only ever called him the man in the picture." They moved the conversation to the station cafe, because a 9-year-old deaf boy sitting alone on a bench while adults argued about attempted assault and coincidental resemblance was, everyone silently agreed, an image none of them could stomach for longer than necessary. The man in the gray coat had a name too, eventually, Victor Anwar, a name that meant nothing to Daniel, and, notably, nothing to Tobias either, when Mira signed it to him. Anwar sat in a holding room 3 floors up, having said exactly 4 words to police. "I want a lawyer." Tobias, it turned out, had come to Faircross Central alone, on a bus, using a paper ticket his mother had given him 3 days earlier, along with an address written in careful block letters, and a photograph, now soft and worn at the corners, from being carried in a backpack pocket. He handed it to Daniel without being asked. It was a photograph of a man in his late 20s, laughing at something outside the frame, standing in front of a building Daniel recognized immediately because he had, in fact, worked on its renovation 11 years ago, a community center near the river that had since been converted into low-income housing. The man in the photo had Daniel's jaw, Daniel's slightly crooked left eyebrow, the one his mother used to say made him look perpetually skeptical of everything, including good news. But it was not Daniel. "That's my brother," Daniel said quietly, and the word seemed to cost him something physical, a small collapse in his shoulders. "That's Elias. He's been missing for 11 years. Mira's pen, which had been taking notes out of old habit, stopped moving entirely. "Missing," she repeated. We never found a body. We never found anything. He went to visit someone and never came home, and after a year the police stopped looking, and after 5 years I stopped hoping, and I have spent the last decade telling myself that hope is just grief that hasn't finished arriving yet." Daniel looked at Tobias, who was watching his face with the careful patience of a child accustomed to waiting for translations. "And now there's a 9-year-old boy who says my brother is his father." Mira signed this, gently, watching Tobias's expression for the tremor of understanding. Tobias's hands moved slowly this time, each sign deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed this exact conversation in his head 100 times on the bus ride here, and was only now discovering it felt different out loud than it had in his imagination. "Mama said if anything ever happened to her, I should find the man in the picture. She said he worked with buildings. She said he had kind eyes and a bad habit of humming when he thought no one was listening." Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. "Elias hums," he said. "God help me, he's always hummed." Her name was Naomi Reyes, and she had been dead for 6 days. Mira learned this only because the police, once summoned properly and briefed on the full shape of the afternoon, moved with the particular urgency reserved for cases involving missing persons, minors, and possible attempted violence tangled into a single incident. A detective named Priya Chandrasekaran arrived within the hour, unhurried in manner, but sharp-eyed in the way of someone who had learned that panic wastes time better spent looking carefully. Naomi had died of a sudden cardiac event in her apartment 3 towns over. Undiagnosed, unexpected, the kind of death that leaves no time for last words, only last instructions folded into a backpack. A neighbor had found her. That neighbor, following instructions Naomi had apparently given months earlier, just in case, had put Tobias on a bus alone with a ticket, an address, and a photograph, rather than call child services immediately. A decision Detective Chandrasekaran clearly found alarming, and one she intended to investigate thoroughly once the immediate danger had passed. She was afraid of something, Chandrasekaran said, laying it out plainly for Daniel and Mira in a back office that smelled of old coffee and newer carpet. A woman doesn't give a neighbor instructions like that unless she believes there's a real reason her son might need to disappear and reappear somewhere specific, fast, without going through the usual channels. Foster care, government records, anything searchable. Searchable by who? Daniel asked. Chandrasekaran's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, toward the floor above where Victor Anwar sat in a room saying nothing. "We're working on that," she said, "but I'll tell you what we found in his coat. A photograph, older, more worn than the boy's. Same man." She paused. "Your brother." The room went very still. "Anwar's been looking for Elias for years," Chandrasekaran continued. "Longer than you'd think, based on what we've pulled so far. And somewhere along the way, it seems he found Naomi Reyes instead. Or found out about her, at least, and started watching her, and by extension, watching for anyone who might lead him closer to Elias. "Why?" Mira asked. "Because someone had to." "That," Chandrasekaran said, "is the part I intend to make him explain." While the detective worked, Mira sat with Tobias in the station cafe, because someone needed to, and because 6 years of interpreting had taught her that children process trauma differently when they have something to do with their hands. She bought him hot chocolate. He drank it slowly, watching her over the rim of the cup with the frank, assessing gaze children reserve for adults they haven't yet decided to trust. "Are you scared?" she signed, when he set the cup down. He considered the question honestly, which she appreciated. "A little, but Mama said if I found him, he'd take care of the scared part." She said he had a soft heart, even though his face looked serious. "Do you believe her?" Tobias looked across the cafe, to where Daniel stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, clearly in the middle of a call that was visibly difficult. His free hand pressed flat against his own chest, as if holding something inside it steady. "He looks like he's trying not to cry," Tobias signed. "Mama used to do that, before she told me things she didn't want me to worry about." Mira glanced over. Daniel had lowered the phone. His eyes were red-rimmed, and when he caught her looking, he didn't try to hide it. "That was my mother," he said, crossing back to the table, sitting down heavily across from them. "Elias's mother, too, obviously. She's been alive 11 years without knowing whether her son is dead or somewhere in the world," humming to himself, unreachable. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I have to tell her there might be a grandson. I have to tell her that before I even know if it's true, because if I don't, and it turns out to be nothing, I will have broken something in her I can't fix twice. Is it true?" Tabir signed, mostly to Tobias, though the question was really for the room. Tobias's hands moved without hesitation. "I don't lie about my father. Mama said lying about him would be like lying about the sun. You can pretend it's not there, but it still burns you if you look at it wrong." Daniel, watching the signs even though he couldn't fully follow the speed, asked Mira to translate, and when she did, something in his face broke open. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of stunned recognition, as though he'd just heard his brother's exact turn of phrase filtered through a 9-year-old's certainty. "He used to say things like that," Daniel murmured. "Elias, he always found the strangest metaphors, and somehow they always made perfect sense." Victor Anwar talked, eventually, though not because anyone broke him. He talked because Detective Chandrasekaran was patient enough to let silence do the work, sitting across the table from him for 11 minutes without saying anything at all, until the weight of his own thoughts became louder than his resolve to keep them contained. "I wasn't going to hurt him," Anwar said finally, meaning Daniel, his voice cracking around the edges of the lie even as he told it. "I panicked. I thought—" He stopped. "You thought what?" Chandrasekaran said. Not a question. A door left open. "I thought he was going to disappear again," Anwar said. "Elias. I've been looking for that man for 6 years, and I finally get a lead. A real one. A woman with a kid who matched the timeline, matched everything. And then she dies, and the kid runs straight at some stranger at a train station like he's been waiting his whole life for exactly that reunion. And all I could think was, he's about to walk away with the only piece of information I've found in 6 years, and I am never getting it back." "Why do you need Elias?" Chandrasekaran asked. 6 years is a long time to look for someone who isn't your family. Anwar's jaw worked silently for a moment. "He saved my life," Anwar said. 11 years ago. Construction accident. I was a foreman on a site he'd flagged as unsafe weeks earlier, and nobody listened to him, including me, because I didn't want to hear that my numbers were wrong. Scaffolding came down. He was the one who pulled me out before the second collapse. Broke his own arm doing it. He swallowed, and then 2 weeks later he just vanished. No note, no warning. and everyone told me he must have had his reasons, must have wanted to disappear, and I believed that for years because it was easier than the alternative. Which was? That something happened to him because of what he saw on that site, because he wouldn't stop asking questions about why the scaffolding failed in the first place, when someone with money on the project had a very good reason to make sure it never got asked again. Anwar's hands were flat on the table now, no longer shaking. I've spent 6 years trying to find him, to warn him, and to apologize, and instead I terrified a kid and assaulted his. He stopped again, visibly searching for the word. His uncle. Detective Chandrasekaran brought the story back to Daniel and Mira like a fragile object she wasn't yet sure how to set down. "There's an old case file," she said. "Cold but not closed. A scaffolding failure at the Marrow Street site, 11 years ago. One fatality, several injuries, and a whistleblower complaint filed 2 weeks before your brother's disappearance, alleging the site's safety inspections had been falsified by a subcontractor cutting corners on materials." She paused. The complaint was filed anonymously, but the language in it, the specific phrasing about load tolerances, matches almost word for word a report your brother filed with his employer around the same time. Daniel felt something cold settle low in his stomach. "You think someone made him disappear?" "I think," Chandrasekaran said carefully, "that 11 years is a long time to hide from something, if hiding is what he did. And I think a woman who instructed her son to run to a stranger the instant she died was a woman who believed, right up until the end, that whatever her partner had been running from was still out there, still capable of hurting the people he loved most." "So where is he?" Daniel said. "If he's alive, if any of this is real." Chandrasekaran didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid a folder across the table. Thin, official, recently assembled. Naomi Reyes worked as a translator for an NGO doing resettlement work along the coast, she said. For the last 4 years, she filed paperwork under a different last name for herself and her son, changed twice. "That's not the behavior of someone hiding from an abusive partner, Mr. Osei. That's the behavior of someone hiding with one. You think Elias is still alive?" "I think," Chandrasekaran said, "that somewhere there is a man who has spent 11 years making sure the people who love him believe otherwise, because he thought it was the only way to keep them safe. And I think today, without meaning to, his son just broke that arrangement wide open." They found him 4 days later, in a fishing town 200 miles north, working under a name that wasn't his, living in a rented room above a hardware store, because Naomi's employer, once contacted, once shown a photograph, once told gently that Naomi had passed, broke down and admitted what she'd sworn for years to keep quiet. The name of the man Naomi had loved, and the town where she used to disappear to twice a year, and the reason she always came back changed, quieter, more careful. Daniel drove up alone. He asked Mira to come, and she said yes, without needing to be asked twice, because some jobs aren't really about interpretation anymore. They're about not letting someone walk into the hardest afternoon of their life without a hand nearby. They found the hardware store easily enough. What they didn't expect, standing outside it in the gray coastal light, was the sound drifting faintly through the open door. Off-key, unself-conscious, the particular tune of someone who believes himself unwatched. Daniel stopped walking. His whole body went still. "That's him," he said, very quietly. "That's the hum." The man who came around the shelving unit at the sound of the bell above the door was thinner than the photograph, grayer at the temples, with a long scar along his jaw that hadn't been there 11 years ago, but his eyes, the moment they landed on Daniel's face, did something no 11 years of hiding could have prepared him for. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, one hand still resting on a shelf of hinges and doorknobs, looking at his brother like a man looking at a ghost he'd made himself believe was necessary to create. "Elias!" Daniel said, and his voice broke completely on the second syllable. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then Elias crossed the small store in 4 strides and pulled his brother into an embrace so fierce it knocked a display of paint samples to the floor, and neither of them cared, and Mira, standing quietly by the door, found she had to look away and blink hard several times before she trusted her own voice enough to speak. "Your son is safe," she said finally, once the 2 men had separated enough to breathe. "He's staying with your mother right now. He's been asking when he'll meet you every day since we found this address." Elias's face crumpled entirely. "My son," he repeated, like the words were unfamiliar in his mouth, despite clearly having lived in his heart for years. "Tobias, I wanted to come back for them so many times. I told myself every year that the danger had passed, and every year something reminded me it hadn't. And I let 11 years happen because I was terrified that the day I came home would be the day I brought it all back with me." "What danger?" Daniel asked. Chandrasekaran found the complaint. "The scaffolding. Is that what this was?" Elias closed his eyes. "The company covering up the failure had a lot to lose," he said. "Enough to make sure the one engineer willing to testify disappeared before he could. I ran because staying meant a trial I wasn't sure I'd survive to see the end of, and because the people who wanted me quiet made it very clear that quiet could extend to anyone I loved." His voice thinned. "I thought leaving would protect you, all of you. I told myself that for 11 years, and somewhere in there I met Naomi, and I let myself believe we could build something small and safe, away from all of it. And I never told her the whole truth even then, because some secrets feel like they'll stay smaller if you never say them out loud." "She knew enough," Mira said gently, "enough to prepare Tobias for exactly this day, enough to make sure that if something happened to her, he'd end up standing on a platform, waiting to recognize you in someone else's face." Elias's breath caught audibly. "She's really gone," he said, not quite a question, and Daniel nodded, and the 3 of them stood in a hardware store that smelled of sawdust and rust, while a father absorbed, for the first time, the full weight of everything he had missed and everything he had, impossibly, still been given back. The trial that followed, brief, procedural, more paperwork than drama, closed the scaffolding case for good, 6 years too late for the man who had died in the original collapse, but not too late to clear Elias's name entirely and put the subcontractor's falsified reports on public record. Victor Anwar, facing charges but cooperating fully, gave testimony that closed the final gaps. Elias, no longer required to vanish, no longer required to hide, walked into a courthouse under his own name for the first time in over a decade and walked out free. Tobias met him 3 weeks after the hardware store, not at a train station this time, but in his grandmother's living room, standing very still by the window as though afraid that moving too fast might make the moment evaporate. Elias knelt down slowly, the way you'd approach something precious and unfamiliar at once, and signed with hands that had clearly practiced every night since Daniel had first told him his son was deaf. Hands that were clumsy, but trying, and trying with everything he had. "Hello? I'm your father. I'm sorry I wasn't there." Tobias studied him for a long moment. The jaw, the crooked eyebrow, the eyes his mother had described so precisely a stranger on a train had nearly been mistaken for him. And then signed back, simply, "Mama said you'd come eventually. She was right about everything." Elias made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and opened his arms, and Tobias walked into them the way he'd walked into Daniel's legs on the platform weeks earlier. Not with hesitation, but with the total, uncomplicated trust of a child who had been told, his whole life, exactly who to look for, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew. Faircross Central looks the same as it always has, the same departure boards clicking over their little segmented cards, the same hurried Monday shuffle, the same forgiving Friday pace. Most of the 200 strangers who stood frozen in that silence have long since forgotten the specifics, the way stations swallow moments and hand them back only as vague unease when you pass through the same platform months later. But Mira still works there most mornings, badge clipped to her coat, watching platforms the way other people watch faces. And sometimes, on a Thursday evening in early autumn, she sees a man with a slightly crooked eyebrow and a boy signing rapidly beside him, on their way somewhere ordinary, a museum, a dinner, nowhere important, and she remembers the exact moment silence fell over 100 strangers who did not yet understand they were about to witness someone come home. Tobias never did learn to fear crowded platforms, though everyone once worried he might. Instead, he developed a habit, small and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its origin. Whenever his father hums without realizing it, off-key and unself-conscious, Tobias reaches over and taps his arm. Just once. Just enough to be noticed. Not to stop him. Just to let him know that someone, finally, is close enough to hear it.
That smile lasted 3 seconds, but it was enough to stop a stranger from disappearing, and enough to bring a father back from 11 years of silence. Think about that for a second. Tobias never heard a single sound in his life. Not the announcement, not the scuffle, not the gasp of 200 strangers holding their breath. But he didn't need to hear danger to stop it. He just needed to trust the face his mother described to him, one last time, before she was gone. Sometimes the people who seem the most vulnerable end up saving everyone around them. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, what part gave you chills? The smile on the platform or the hum in that hardware store? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next story.